Hi there, I'm Mr. Fay. Welcome to the desk light soldering demonstration. We will cover everything to do with safety, what equipment we're going to be using, what components we'll be using, and how to properly solder these bits together. I'll also at the end include some bits about problems you may encounter at the end of soldering. If you're watching this video again as a reminder on how to do a particular part or solder a particular component, then jump to the times that are on the screen now. Okay, this first section is going to all be about safety. Okay, so first of all, the PPE that we're going to be wearing are safety glasses. These are really important because essentially the solder is going to be turning into liquid metal and it's going to be very, very hot. We don't want this to go in our eyes. It's a really important part. The second part of safety is obviously keeping a clean and well-organized workstation. This will make it a lot easier for you when you're actually coming to solder these intricate little pieces, and it just means the hot soldering iron is away from everything else. It makes it safe and easy. The next thing about safety is regards to the heat generated from the soldering iron. This is very hot. This is what's going to be melting the solder, so you only touch the yellow handle, okay? Everything else on the end here is very, very hot. Even the holder down here will get very hot too, so just be super careful that none of that is touched. And also keep wires away from the soldering iron. This can obviously burn through cables, and we don't want that because that will then be an additional electrocution hazard. And lastly, just be aware of those around you, other people in the class or people working on the same table. This will just prevent any burns or any other injuries. So, what equipment will we be using? So with regards to the equipment, obviously I've talked about the soldering iron. The soldering iron heats up the solder, and basically on the end here is a chiseled end, and I'll explain more about that when we come to solder the individual components. So the next bit of equipment is the clamp board. Okay, so the clamp board just works as a nice way of clamping your components using the crocodile clips or other clamps available. Okay, it just acts as another hand, and it makes it a lot easier to be able to manage to do the soldering that you need to do. Also, it acts as a bit of a heat sink to some of the other components, but I'll talk to you more about that when soldering the LEDs. Okay, and the last bit of equipment that we're going to be using is the wire strippers. This is just to strip the ends of the wires to expose the copper, which will be soldering. Nice and easy, and I'll actually show you this when it comes to doing the wire preparation. So, what components are we going to be using for this desk light project? So let's start off talking about the strip board. With the strip board, you'll notice there's lots of holes. This is for the wires and the components to actually fit into for soldering. And then you'll notice on one side of the board, there is copper strips going all the way from top to bottom. You'll notice that's only on one side, and we need to make sure anything that we solder, we're actually soldering onto the copper side. The next component that we're going to be talking about are the LEDs. With regards to the two LEDs you'll be using, they're exactly the same, and you'll notice that there's a long leg and a short leg. The long leg signifies that it's a positive, so the red wire would go to that, and then the short leg is negative, which the black wire would go towards. If by any chance the legs of the LED were snipped, so they were the same length, a way to tell which one was the negative one is on the edge of the LED there's a little flat surface, and that is a nice reference surface to show that the leg nearest it is the negative one. For your desk light, you'll also have two resistors. Resistors basically resist the amount of electricity flowing through it. So basically, with regards to LEDs, they would blow just with a 9-volt battery attached to it. So this cuts down the power just to the right amount, so the LEDs last a lot longer and more efficiently. We'll also be using a switch, which obviously allows current to flow through your circuit, or not. And you'll also be using a battery clip. This is a way to connect your 9-volt battery to your circuit. You're also going to need a selection of wires, just so we can attach certain components to your circuit. You're going to need 2 red wires, 2 black wires, and also a slightly longer black wire. Before actually getting on with the soldering, we need to know what order we're going to solder it in. And I would normally say the most sensible way of doing it is through the journey of the electricity. So the electricity would go through the red battery clip, through to the resistor, then it goes down to the first red LED wire, then it comes back down the black LED wire, goes to the second resistor, then it goes to the second LED, back through the black wire of the LED, and then off to the switch and back to the battery clip. This is definitely the best way for you to solder all your components onto your circuit, but for the benefit of this video, I'm going to be doing it by component. To start us with the soldering, we need to tin some of the ends of certain of the components. And what tinning is, it's basically putting a small layer of solder on the end of the components. So basically, when you bring them together, all you need to do is add a tiny little bit of heat really quickly, and they solder together really nicely. It's a really nice, clean way to solder, and I'm going to show you that now. The first thing you're going to have to tin is all the end of the wires. But to do that, we need to strip the ends of the wire, and I'm going to show you that now. To strip the end of the wires, which you're going to have to do every end of every wire, is put it into the head of the strippers here, and then gently push and squeeze the handles, and the end sheath comes off, leaving a bit of the wire exposed at the ends. You've got to do that with every end on every wire. So now to tin the ends of the wires that you've just stripped the ends off of, you basically put one into the clamp, you pick up your solder and your soldering iron, you apply a little bit of solder to the end of your soldering iron on the little chisel tip. Then come down and you hold the bit of solder on the end of your soldering iron to the wire, and you add a tiny little bit of solder to it. So the soldering iron is heating up the wire, and then you're just adding a little bit of this solder onto the wire, not the end of the soldering iron. I'll do it again with this one. So a bit of solder is on there. There we go. And if I show you this close up, you'll see that it's tinned the ends with a fine bit of solder. Now I've tinned all the ends of the wires, I can move on to tinning the legs of the LEDs. When soldering or tinning an LED, the heat will travel up to the legs and damage the end of the LED. So the way to do this is use the crocodile clip, clamp it over the legs like this, and any heat traveling up the legs will go into the crocodile clip, cooling basically the end. So I'm going to clamp it just here, and then when you come to tin it, you just do exactly the same. Tiny little bit of solder on the end of your soldering iron, heat up the end of the legs, and then just add a tiny little bit of solder to each of the end of the legs like this. You need to do this with both LEDs. So just an example, here's the second one. And as a close-up, you'll see that it doesn't actually take a lot of solder to tin the end of a wire. Sometimes it's hard for you to see, but that is tinned. And when you've tinned both of your LEDs, you'll work on the switch, and you'll basically tin the two legs in exactly the same way. And the last bit of tinning is to do the end of the battery clip. Exactly the same way as doing the other wires. The first component I'm going to show you to solder onto your circuit is going to be the resistors. So the resistors, obviously on your diagram, there's two placements, so you should know exactly the holes that they're going to go through. For the resistors, you actually want the legs to be coming through the back up to this copper surface. So the resistors are actually going to lay on the back. This is the reason, because if you go to place them through this side, there's nothing actually to solder onto, there's no metal, so you want to actually be soldering onto the copper. So the first leg can go through the first hole, and then it's going to go all the way across to there. And what you can do is you can pull it through, so you've got your two legs sticking out this side, and then your resistor should lay nice and flat on this side, okay? What I would do is just move the legs apart from each other like that, and you'll find that it holds in quite nicely, so you don't need to hold it in whilst soldering. It will hold by itself like that. And then we're going to put it in the clamp. I'm going to use the soldering iron, and we're going to just put a tiny little bit of solder on the end of the soldering iron, just to clean it off, okay, for this one, because you always want to be dealing with a really nice, clean soldering tip, okay? Then you apply just a tiny bit of solder to the end, and then you're basically heating up the copper strip and the wire at the same time, and then you are applying a bit of solder to the wire. And then you let go, and you should have a really nice blob of solder where you need it to be. And there you can see you've got a really nice solder joint there. You can bring in some snips and just snip off these legs when they're done. Like that. With the LEDs, first job is to actually solder on a wire to each of the legs. Okay, so as I said before, the long leg will be your positive, so your red, and your short leg will be black, which will be the negative. So the best thing to do is spray the legs open a little bit like that, makes it a little bit more easy, and then clamp it. Then you take your first wire, which we're going to do the tinned red wire first, and that's going to go on this long leg. So all we need to do is apply a tiny little bit of solder to the end of your soldering iron, because it transfers the heat better. Come and hold the wire next to the leg, which you want to do, and you're just going to add a tiny bit of heat. And because as we've tinned this before, it's going to join together really easily just by adding a little bit of heat there. So as you can see now, we've got a really strong, I'm going to yank it, connection on this long leg. So same again, we're going to do the black wire. So tiny bit of solder on the end, like that. Line it up to where you want the join to be, and then you're just adding a tiny little bit of heat to those two tinned surfaces, and now you've got your wires on. You need to do that with both LEDs. Now the wires are on the LEDs, we're able to put the wires into the board. So we take our first red wire, consult your diagram just to know exactly where it's going to go, and you're basically placing it through there. And if you bend it again, like I said, it should hold there without having to hold it while soldering. And we're going to do exactly the same solder as we did before. So grab a tiny bit of solder on the end of your soldering iron, and then going up to heating up the wire and the copper strip, and then applying some solder to the copper strip and the wire, not the end of the soldering iron. And then you should get a really nice end like this. Obviously, any little wires coming through the end, you can give it a little snip again. And that's one wire done. And you do exactly the same with the black wire. So I know that the black wire is going to come through to here. Same again, bend it up, clamp it down. Sometimes you might find the wire does come out like that, so try and put it in again and make sure it doesn't fall through. And then grab a little bit of solder on your soldering iron, applying it to the copper strip and the wire, and then bringing it away like that. Job done. Give it a snip. That's one LED done. With regards to the switch, we're not actually straight away going to put this onto the board. We need to connect a wire to one of the legs of the switch first, and then the black wire of the battery clip is going to go onto the other side. First of all, you take your tinned legs of your switch, clamp it up. Then you take your longer black wire that you have left, You're going to put a tiny bit of solder like we'd normally do on the end of your soldering iron. And clean off this soldering iron. And you'll see you've got a really nice connection there with your one wire. So the next leg needs to go to the black battery clip. So we do exactly the same, clamp it up. A little bit of solder on the end of the soldering iron. Bring it up to the leg. Apply a tiny little bit of heat. Let it cool down. Clean the solder tip. And there you have your battery clip on one leg and then your black wire on the other leg. Now we need to put this leg actually into our board. First of all, we consult our diagram to know where this black lead's going to go. And I know that it goes 2 spaces